Clayman Media. Welcome to the We Bear Witness podcast. Tune in every week for practical Christianity, biblical teachings, and great conversation. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the We Bear Witness podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Today is a very special day. We have a really great conversation ahead with Neil Shenvi and Joe Rigney. Neil is the author of Critical Dilemma and Why Believe. Neil, I've never met you in person, brother, but I did sit next to your friend and writing buddy, Pat Sawyer, at the Engaging Truth Conference years ago, where I first received my copy of your book, Why Believe, and have finished that and read that. Love it. It's a great apologetics book for those of you who'd like to purchase it. And then I read Critical Dilemma right after that. So like my friendship with Dean and Sarah and Andrew Walker, I have Eric Reed to thank for our connection. I should send him a new hoodie. And Joe, that was the same time you and I believe, met in that Engaging Truth Conference when you came with Piper, who was the big headliner there a few years back. And now Joe Rigney is the Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews and author of the new book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, which I believe is an incredible book. Both of you are very gifted writers. Welcome, Joe. Welcome, Neil. Thank you guys so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Adam.
Yep. Now, we only have about half an hour to cover a lot of things, and a lot of people have wanted to hear from the two of you on this, the concept or conversation of the woke right. Neil, you recently wrote an article for your site, shenviapologetics.com, for those interested, titled, What is the Woke Right? And so for those who have not had the chance to read your article yet, number one, I think you should, but you might see this phrase, captivating social network water coolers. You mentioned in your article, Dan Crenshaw mentioned it back in 2022. I think it was during an MSNBC interview or something like that. And then you had Kevin DeYoung write an article back in, I can't believe it was that long ago he wrote that article, but it was like fall of 2022 that he wrote an article, kind of for the dissident right moving to the woke right. And he doesn't frame the arguments the way you frame your arguments, but you can definitely tell you were somewhat inspired by DeYoung's position, at least among other things. So in your best paraphrase, Neil, to kick us off, what is the woke right? And second, why are people arguing its mere existence?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Good introduction. If people want documentation, I do in my article go through all of the sort of primary sources. The term did not originate with me. The funny thing is people who don't like that terminology, I point out to them that I actually borrowed it, not from Kevin DeYoung primarily, but from a guy named Sean DeMars. He did an interview in April with Joe and Doug Wilson, and he asked them the question, what do you guys think about the woke right? And then Joe chimed in and said, oh, you mean like the dissident right? He said, so DeMars says, do you believe in the woke right? Joe said, oh, like basically the equivalent of the woke left, but the dissident right guys. And then Doug Wilson responded that this is actually, I'm quoting here, by the way, this is actually something I'm quite concerned about on the right is identity politics on the right. These are people who've been taunted their entire adult lives for being white. And finally, they say, I might as well be proud of it. I'm going to be white and proud and start hating Jews. That's a big concern of mine. So if you look at a timeline, so that interview was posted on April 18th. Joel Berry, who's an editor for the Babylon Bee, talked about the woke right the next day. He talked about, this is his quote, a tweet that he tweeted the very next day, his first use of the term woke right. He says, saying that culture's downstream of race, a core tenet of Groyper occultism. These are Nick Fuentes fans who hate the Jews and they call everyone a Jew. He says it's dumb. It's claiming your religion comes from your blood type. Woke right cultists worship the creature rather than the creator. Mark and avoid. So the bottom line is this phenomenon that the term comes from, at least in the evangelical world, comes from Sean DeMars and Joe and Doug Wilson. Then I began using the term descriptively to talk about this phenomenon. Now, so long story short, I define the woke right in terms of four ideas. Society is divided into straight white men and their enemies, through to the hegemonic norms, the Longhouse, the post-war consensus, Judeo-Christianity. But normies are blind. Normal people are blind to that fact. So 3, we need to red pill them. And 4, retake the West, retake America. So that's how I define the woke right. But if people don't like the label, I say in my article, you can use a different label. You can call it the identitarian right. You can call it the dissident right. You can call it the new right. I'm just trying to identify the set of ideas descriptively and say, hey, some people are believing these things, and it seems like a real phenomenon that we should be concerned about as Christians, even if you call it something else. So does that help define it, determine where it came from?
Yeah, it's a good paraphrase. Joe, what are your immediate thoughts on that in terms of it's Neil's working definition and where he's drawn it from, since your name was mentioned in that DeMars interview?
Yeah, I think the in terms of how I answered John's question and where Doug went with it was towards sort of the what I would call the Anon Groiper army, the guys on Twitter who are big Fuentes fans and have and do the frog thing, and they're anonymous, and there is really an identitarian dimension. I think part of the challenge though is that when Neil goes on to unpack it in his article, he's not pointing at like he mentions those anonymous accounts, but it's Christian, but he's pointing to things like Stephen Wolfe, C.J. Engel, Andrew Isker as sort of representations of this ideology. And so it's that conflation. I think that's kind of like the easy conflation that happens. And there's a broader conflation that happens. I know that like when Neil's done interviews with someone like Owen Strachan, the target gets even bigger because all of a sudden it's like Christian nationalists. So it's like woke, dissident right, woke right, Christian nationalists are sort of like this thing. But if the baseline definition and where the term was introduced was what Doug and I were talking about was the guys who were like, I'm white, I'm proud of my skin color, and I hate Jews, then it's like, yeah, that's a marginal thing online, a very online marginal thing that I don't think warrants think pieces and all kinds of stuff. I just think it's like it should be ignored and dismissed, right? Just don't make it a big thing. Don't give them any traction. It can be mocked. Doug does that pretty frequently whenever he talks about that kind of thing. But then to conflate that with guys like Stephen Wolfe or others who are making sort of substantive arguments for Christian political order, or C.J. Engel's article on Heritage Americans, and to say that's woke right too, and say, okay, wait, so are they proud of their skin color and hate Jews? Like, is that the claim that's being made? Is that which is even distinct from questions that people have about, Israel's influence on American foreign policy, where there's a discussion about that, like how much should we be involved in these foreign wars? All of which I think are inbounds questions to be asked. We had Andrew on Doug and Friends at some point to talk about how to orient to Jews, and had some good back and forth and push on that sort of question. But I think that's an inbounds conversation. But that's distinct from the sort of Hitler posting, Hitler had a point, Hitler was the Christian prince kind of stuff that these anonymous accounts do. And I think that's stupid and dumb and bad for the souls of the guys doing it. But I don't think it represents some kind of like counterbalancing or major threat to Christian churches in the way that, say, wokeness on the left does. So my initial reaction is, yes, if it's a thing, it's this sort of anonymous Groiper thing, or if it has spokesman, it's a Nick Fuentes, maybe a Candace Owens, though I don't follow her enough to know if she's kind of in that same kind of camp. Obviously, she's not the white version of that, but if there's this kind of like really strongly actual anti-Semitic thing, so it does exist, but I don't think it exists in the places where Neil then unpacks when he's talking about the woke right. Instead, I would say that the idea of the dissident right, I think that's a term that those guys would probably own, and is a slightly different characterization. It's right-wing guys who diverge from post-war consensus and sort of fusionist American conservatism, and are seeking to recover more older ideas or older forms of conceiving of conservatism and political order. And so they're dissidents in that they're outside the mainstream. And I think they'd own that term. And I think that that's a real thing. And that's broader than Christians. That includes non-Christians, the guys like Curtis Yarvin. Aaron McIntyre is a Christian, but I think would be more in that kind of like straddling the secular space. He's not a church writer or anything like that. But then you've got pastors like Isker or guys like that. So those would be guys that I would say would be dissident right. And Christian nationalists might be a subset, or there'd be a Venn diagram that would have some overlap there. But I think that the use of the term woke right there is unhelpful.
So what I hear you saying is that like I said, there's a Venn diagram. It's helpful. There's the Christian nationalists, And then some subset of Christian nationalists are part of the dissident right.
Right.
And some subset of the dissident right are these sort of anonymous Groyper accounts, anti-Semitic, white nationalists but they're not identical. And I agree with that. So, for example, I would even say there's a difference. We just saw the other day that Al Mohler endorses some kind of robust Christian engagement with politics. Whether you want to call that Christian nationalism or not, it's unclear at this point. But there's that. Then there's Doug Wilson, who has sort of very distant future Christian theonomy, versus Stephen Wolfe talking about the Christian Prince. So there's a spectrum there. There's a spectrum on the dissident right. There's a spectrum but there is some subset called the woke right that does have these disturbing characteristics. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I think as long as, but I think again, is if we're limiting it to if it's Fuentes and his crew, his anonymous crew, I think that's fine to say, yeah, that's a thing and it's out there. But then what I'm objecting to is the then attempt to associate that with American reformer type stuff, Engel's article on Heritage America, or Wolf's writings on various things, and saying if you're trying to make that the danger of it is it is actually a kind of a guilt by association. It appears to be a guilt by association tactic. Here's some really obvious objectionable stuff. Here's a guy doing Hitler posting. Hitler had a point. Hitler's a Christian Prince, anonymous stuff online to troll people. And then here's someone who's making, a 400-page argument for Christian nationalism, and to say, and he's got some, and he's already talked about what ethnicity is and things like that. And these are in the same category. This is the same movement. These are part of the same movement. And it's like, I just think that's an unfair characterization. So.
Sure. So one of the things I did in my article is that I actually cited things by Wolfe and his co-host and Isker and Engel that I think do. So I characterize the woke right by these four ideas. Right. And it wasn't that I said that these guys are all just anti-Semites and they love Hitler. It's not my characterization. There are other ideas like that straight white males are this out group, and they're them and their allies are the targets of the left. Everyone they're oppressed by these ideas. So here's some quotes from Wolfe's book, though. This is what Kevin DeYoung picked up on 2 years ago, that it does seem like what he called right-wing wokeism. So here's some quotes that he highlighted. So Wolfe says in his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, every step of progress is overcoming you. Ask yourself, what sort of villain does each event of progress have in common? The straight white male. That is the chief outgroup of New America, the embodiment of regression and oppression. He wrote, we live under a gynocracy, a rule by women. He wrote that the secularist regime is an existential, Christian nationalism is an existential threat to the secularist regime. They are enemies of the church and as such, enemies of the human race. He says, if you are a white, heterosexual, cisgendered male, then the world will not offer you any favors. Indeed, your career advancement depends on sacrificing your self-respect by praising and pandering to your inferiors who rule over you. So now I have some friends who have, worked tirelessly against critical race theory, like Monique Duson, who founded the Center for Biblical Unity, and she, when I read these quotes to her, she's like, yeah, this is what we see, but just on the right. This is like the left-wing critical theory, but just the right-wing version where we have the oppressed and oppressors, and they're oppressed not by tyranny. I mean, no, straight white males don't go around in shackles. It's these ideas that are oppressing them. And they even use that language. So Brian Sauvé, I think it was, who's kind of in this group of Christian nationalists, certainly. But he actually had a post the other day where he does say that Americans are oppressed. And he gives examples of straight white males being openly disdained as the enemies. And that's a form of oppression. But that's not how the dictionary defines oppression. This is the same problem we see on the left, where they say, oh, if you're a person of color, you're oppressed all the time. Well, by what? Are you enslaved? Are you? No, just by these systems and structures, and whiteness oppresses you. But, Brian said, well, yeah, like in elite medical schools, he said, being a white male, this is a quote, try being a white male student applying to elite medical schools. He said things like, it's systemic. This oppression is systemic. It's built into nearly every part of political and economic and social systems. Now that phrase sounds like something that a critical race theorist would say. He says, quote, try being an openly Christian white male applying for an executive position at a large company today. Now, right or wrong, I'm not saying it's false or true yet. I'm just saying that does sound like something a critical race theorist would say, only because he's redefined oppression to talk about not actual overt tyranny, coercion, lack of agency. He's going to talk about ideas, systemic norms, discrimination, disdain. So do you see that as a correspondence between how critical race theorists think and how this other group, this woke right group, thinks, or not?
Yeah. So I think that you have outlined some similarities, but I think that there's a couple of the notable differences would be things like the first question would be like, but is it true? Like, regardless of whether or not there's similarities in the structures of the argument, the question is it true? And so I would look at something like Jeremy Carl's recent book on anti-white racism to say like, hey, he walks through, about 10 to 15 and he had a lot more that he could have gone into. I've talked to him about it. And sort of 10 to 15 different areas of society in which at both like kind of the ideological or the hegemonic level, but even down to the policies and procedures and laws and everything else, where there is this kind of asymmetrical application of law and custom and hiring practices and whatever else. And so that would be the issue is like, but so in the same way that I know that, Neil, I've heard you talk before about like, yeah, there are structural systems of oppression at various times in history, slavery, Jim Crow, things like that. So those sort of things do exist. The question is like, now, does it? Is there, and is it true that if you look at the sort of the dominant narratives propounded in America today, that the villain throughout history is the straight white male? Like, is that actually how the stories are told? And I think in that case, the answer is right. And to the point, one of the things what I read on the ideological side when I was reading your article was it seems like you were at one point you would object to like kind of the dissident right claim that there's sort of this hegemonic woke hegemony and anti-white racism and things like that. And you kind of objected to it as simplistic and therefore incorrect and things like that. But then at the end of the article, you say left-wing wokeness is the dominant ideology in nearly every area of society: politics, media, education, business, sport, even religion. And so it seems like there you grant the point, like that's Brian's point in the quote in the tweet you just mentioned, is that like the dominant ideology across big education, big tech, big media, big government, big business, just pick all the bigs of society and say, what's the dominant ideology? And it's like, it is this sort of wokeness that is hostile to or disfavors certain folks based on the skin color or their ethnicity or their religion, right? So like that kind of white guys, Christian, conservative Christians, things like that. And so you grant the point there that Brian and Stephen and the rest of those guys are making, while earlier kind of objecting to it. And so I think part of the issue is you're taking them to be like making a universal claim when they're making a general claim, right? They're making, so it's a generalization. It seems to me like, hey, this is the general truth, but not necessarily like a universal truth. So that if you found sort of examples in which it didn't apply, I think that they could go, yeah, that's fine. But like, again, on the whole, as a general characterization, it seems like you're agreeing with them on the like facts on the ground.
Sure. And I talked to Brian about this. So there are two big objections I have, actually. So I agree, obviously, that there is a woke hegemony, right? That's the narrative, right? In large sections of society, not every section, granted. Right. But one thing is that it's still not oppression. You have to redefine the word oppression, like you to redefine the word trauma or bigotry. Sure. To mean something it doesn't. Oppression refers to, look in the dictionary, unjust treatment, control, tyranny, lack of agency, slavery. And what I was doing 2 years ago in our book, Critical Dilemma, we talk about when people say things like blacks are oppressed in the US, what Pat actually will do is he'll go sit them down and say, okay, you're black, you're oppressed, yes. He'll say, walk me through your last 24 hours, every half an hour. Tell me how you experienced oppression in that half an hour. What did you do today at 9 o'clock? I went to coffee at a coffee shop. Okay, were you oppressed in the coffee shop? Well, no, I just had coffee. Okay, 30 minutes later, what were you doing? And they walk through the day and realize I've never been oppressed in the last 24 hours. I haven't been. So, and Brian, but he used the term oppressed. That's what I'm saying. Hey, we can't redefine the word oppressed. Do you experience some sort of general, do some people in society look down on you because of your ethnicity? Sure, as a white man, yeah. Does that happen for blacks also? Yeah, that happens too. But Hispanics, men, women, everybody has some people that they'll say, we don't like your skin color or your gender. But that's not oppression. We can't psychologize oppression that way. We don't redefine the word trauma. We don't redefine the word bigot. We don't redefine the word homophobia or transphobia. We just say these words mean something. The other thing I would say is that the seeing everything, I know they're generalizing, and you say, well, but the facts are that there's this woke hegemony. Well, yes and no. Just like critical race theorists will point out, there's these systems and structures that lead to sort of these outcomes. If you look at the outcomes, though, straight white men are overrepresented at virtually every level of society. 90% of congressmen and senators are male, and I think 80% are white. So I think 30% of people in the U.S., 34% are white men in America. But like 70% of congressmen and senators are. Every president but Obama has been a white male. CEOs, like at 90, 80% straight white males. You look at all the white wealth, right? What we know that wealth is predominantly disproportionately male and white. It just is. Now, I'm not saying that overturns the idea that, say, big tech has anti-white animus. I'm not saying that means that Harvard's admission policy is fair. It's not. We saw that Supreme Court decision. I am saying it doesn't. It actually contradicts the actual data to say that we live in the system that is biased against straight white males. The ideas might be, but the on-the-ground realities don't reflect the idea that you're an oppressed group. Does that make sense? Like you're certainly not enslaved. And even the idea that if I'm not going to get a fair shake in society. I'm like, well, that could be locally, you're applying to Harvard, but I don't see that in the data. Now, if you could show me data, it says, oh yeah, overall, the general structure is that whites in the U.S. are suffering, and they're doing worse than blacks and Hispanics and Asians. I just don't see that.
Yeah. So again, I'd point to Carl's book again as sort of like if you're looking for like the sort of the data, I'd point to Jeremy's book. But I think the other thing is, while I'm sensitive to the idea of don't do language inflation, don't do concept creep, don't take like what happened with trauma, like what's happened with abuse, where you take things that had sort of more substantial definitions and then you enlarge them to encompass more phenomenon. I'm sensitive to that and think like that's a fair point in terms of the precision of language. I do think though that part of what a number of these guys are seeking to highlight is the psychological dimension, which is basically, which is something that I've written about in terms of the emotional sabotage. It's about the way that groups get steered by certain narratives and ideologies to where, hey, look, you guys, you have to shut up because you're not allowed to speak to this. You're not allowed to talk about this. So even if you have, if the numbers work out, it's still the case that to like actually say, yeah, but we want to, here's what we want to do. Here's what we think would be good for America. You're not allowed to do that because of America's history of racial oppression. And I think like the immigration issue is probably like the nearest one. This comes up a lot in this discussion about sort of conservatives' desire to actually have a functional border, one that actually keeps people out, and not to simply allow the floodgates to be opened. And so some of this is anticipatory, I think. So American identity is contested. And we live in a moment where the numbers in terms of like majority culture and all of those sort of things are still in flux. But there's been this like massive wave of illegal immigration. And then on top of that, the legal forms of immigration as well, that people are understandably concerned about. Like, what does this mean for us, especially given the setup? So it's like you're watching a game of chess or some game of chess, and you can see if you're a good enough player, you can see that, hey, the pieces are getting set up to box us in. There's a woke hegemony in all the major institutions of power, and then there's a massive sort of population rearrangement that's underway with the expressed desire of one of the political parties and the impotence of the other. Right? Whatever, there may be a minority that want to actually do something about it, but will they actually have the ability? Will they actually have the courage to follow through and to do something to secure the border. And in that moment, the psychological thing is actually one of the major barriers, because you can't, to say that, no, we want America to be this. It's like, you're not allowed to do that because racism. And it's like, and so what you have with guys like Stephen or guys like CJ Engel trying to articulate, like, what is it that constitutes American identity? And I think I think that they've actually been helpful to try to say, look, it's not fundamentally about skin color, though in the American history, skin color has been a rough and ready and has been, was used as a tool of oppression in terms of the racial stratification under slavery and Jim Crow. But that there really is something like an American identity, an American ethnic identity, an ethnos, that was downstream. It was Anglo-Protestant. I read some of Neil your quotes that you from your forthcoming book or something like that. This deal, and thought again that was another place where, like, it seemed to me that you were granting all of the points, the substantive points of the dissident right guys on this question, that there is such a thing as an American ethnos. Historically, it was largely white, but not exclusively so. It was capable of assimilating peoples, and that there's an asymmetry in terms of how that's used. Like, Black people are allowed to have both a race and an ethnicity, so a skin color thing, but also an ethnic identity, and whites are denied that in the modern sort of racial hierarchy. And that it's legitimate for them to want to, and to say, yeah, like, what ethnicity do I belong to? Like, what is actually not my race, if we're going to use that as sort of the phenotype skin color question, but what's my ethnicity? And sometimes people are like, well, you have to go back to your European ancestors 400 years ago to find it. And I'm like, that's stupid. Like, You're
not Dutch.
Or Irish. I mean, it would be Irish for me. And it's like, I'm grateful that somewhere back there was some Irish and Scotch Irish or whatever. But like, I'm an American. What is that? I'm an American. And so what does that mean? And it's like, but you're not allowed to say, no, you're not, you can't just say you're an American, or that your ethnicity is sort of the dominant or core one around which America was founded and which it persisted for 150 years. You don't get to do that anymore. Why? Slavery, Jim Crow, dangers of nationalism, et cetera. And it's that psychological barrier that some of these guys are really trying to push on.
It sounds like there's a lot more agreement between you and Neil's position in terms of the problems at hand in a generalization, like that no one's ignoring the real problems occurring psychologically and even implementedly toward in our government when it comes to how things are happening in our culture. But what I'm seeing is, Neil, you have thought the how this is being handled by what we would call this woke right, farther right from the dissident right, even as someone who has been a big adversary against CRT. We need to remember that about Neil. Neil has written extensively against the woke left. He's probably not making a lot of friends on either side of that right now. But I think that's an important part of this, because what you're arguing is that you're seeing similar characteristics between this woke left and the people like Engel and Stephen Wolfe. And I mean, most of your article are pretty much excerpts from their books. And these are people that Joe spends probably a decent amount of time around, or at least knows through Canon Press, being that Canon Press is who published the Case for Christian Nationalism. But this hasn't been about Christian nationalism. This is talking to me. I thought the dominance in your article was about the ethnocentrism that Joe mentioned just now. I think that was a huge part of this. And we've started the whole podcast by disavowing Nazi viewpoints on ethnicity and all that. So I think that's an important part of it, because some people will take this and run with it in the wrong direction. But you have some interesting quotes here from the article, like Engel's definition of heritage American. Joe, did you read that part of it? I can't shake this feeling that much of the existence of woke right in the minds of many would collapse if the ethnocentric beef were rightly squashed here and now. Like no matter how much you slice this pie, it can, to people, Joe, who are not distinguishing between that, what you call like generalization and then globalization of thought in this conversation, it can sound unapologetically like kinism. I mentioned the word kinism to Stephen Wolfe, and Joe and I are friends. I've told you this before, Joe, in our group chat, that I mentioned that word to Stephen and I got blocked. So he was just kind of on a blocking rampage there for that. But
right. Well, and I think that's because people read him on ethnicity and immediately say, "Oh, you're a kinist," and he's like, "I'm not a kinist." Kinist implies this kind of like hard and fast. The peoples are separate and must never mingle. And Stephen's Stephen believes in ethnogenesis. He mentions that, like, I didn't have a word for it before, and then like it was in his book, like this word ethnogenesis, that like that ethnos can come into existence over time, but that they are, I think the issue, and so because the conversation is fraught, and it immediately goes to this kind of like the rhetoric gets dialed up, the angst gets dialed up because oh no, as opposed to going like, you know, for Wolf, and I think for I don't know CJ as well. I've met him once, and I've read that article. But that there is such a thing, like that ethnicity, and I think this is again where Neil agrees. And what's funny is I've got a book on my shelf by Stephen Bryan. It's a Crossway book on ethnicity, on cultural purposes of God, or something like that. Stephen Bryan, I think he's a Wheaton guy, in which he defines ethnicity and as sort of like shared culture, shared history, shared attachment to place, shared customs, shared stories, things like that. And the funny thing is this is a Crossway book, and his definition of ethnicity is basically identical to Stephen Wolf's in the Case for Christian Nationalism, and seems to be very similar to what CJ is arguing for in his Heritage American, because it is about shared culture, language, customs, law, history, experiences, attachment to a particular location. That's what an ethnos is, and they're stable, but they're permeable, and there is a fluidity. They do develop, they do grow and change over time as events happen, for example. Which is why in CJ's quote, he's like Ellis Island immigrants, which I think if I'm reading him rightly, he thinks it was a mistake to have this kind of like whole-scale immigration as a matter of political policy. But it happened, like the event happened, and those groups of people were largely assimilated into Anglo-Protestantism. So they came from Poland, they spoke Polish, they were Catholic, but within a generation or two, their kids are playing baseball and rooting for the Mets and whatever, you know. So it's like, and they've been assimilated, and they speak English, and they go to the local community Bible church. And so it's like within a generation, there's been assimilation, and key big events kind of forge this, it seems to me, in terms of how Stephen and CJ think about it. I think this is helpful. The Great Depression, World Wars, fighting for your nation, right? All of a sudden forges and assimilates people into some kind of ethnicity. Their point, though, is that the original thing that was being assimilated into and affected by, but assimilated into, was Anglo-Protestantism, like that, and that was actually a thing. But that's the thing that you're not allowed to say, hey, we should like be that. Like I can be that, and I can be like, yeah, I can operate according to it. I can be happy about it. I want to say proud about it, but like that's where even the hesitation comes. Like, am I allowed to be proud that I'm an Anglo-Protestant? In the same way that an African-American could be proud to be African-American, or a Nigerian, because I'm proud to be Nigerian. It's like, can they do that? And it's like, yeah, we think that's all fine. Like that kind of ethnic pride it's not an absolute superiority, but it's just, I'm glad to be this. I'm happy with my people. Am I allowed to do that? And so it's that advocacy, but in the modern, because this is where the psychological hegemony stuff comes into play, is everybody gets spooked. Everybody gets spooked at that point because they think, where's this going to go? Are you advocating for, let's bring back Jim Crow, or let's bring back slavery? And it's like, no, like that's crazy. No, like nobody's doing that unless you're going to say, hey, the anonymous Groyper army that trolls everybody. And it's like, well, I'm not talking about that.
Which everyone is dismissing that.
Exactly, which everybody's dismissing. And so it's more like, can we actually have the kind of reasoned conversation about what does ethnic identity consist in? And is there an American one? And what would it mean for Americans to act in their own interests for their own good? And how does that affect social, political order, things like that? I think that one other thing I just wanted to make sure I got on the table about like the asymmetries between what Neil calls woke left and woke right is and I think it's the biggest difference at some level, is that the woke left was committed to this kind of deconstructionist project where there was that kind of postmodern the critical consciousness, critical theory, post Marxist stuff underneath, where you're deconstructing the West and you're deconstructing reason. And this is why you get those the flowering of it was like, if you believe in rational argument, well, that's a imposition of whiteness. And so it was the deconstructing of rational argumentation of the Bible, of the historic of narratives of Western civilization. And it seems to me like this is a fundamental asymmetry in that when the dissident right guys are arguing for, hey, we need to be aware of hegemonies and the way that these kind of big narratives can affect our thinking and can blind us. which is something that does happen, there's an attempt to actually recover reason. Like Stephen Wolfe is like, his book is just syllogisms. Like it's largely like, he's like, I want to make rational arguments for, here's my definition, therefore here's this point, therefore this. And so he's arguing syllogistically, and there's an attempt to recover sort of that history of reformed political thought, not a deconstruction of all political thought as power plays. And so there's two things happening. One is the arguments, and then Stephen does comment on why is it that we can't actually engage on the arguments. And that's where he brings in this critical consciousness, hegemonic stuff to explain why is it that here's my definitions, why can we not just have the reasoned debate about where my logic has been mistaken? Well, it's because race brain. It's because the categories, and we've been so shaped by modern liberalism leading into woke hegemony that we can't do it without getting very anxious, without getting very agitated by the conversation at all. And he's just pointing out like, hey, we need to get over it. If we're going to have the conversation about what's good, what's biblical, what's theologically true, then we have to get over this psychological hump and be able to have that calm reasoned discussion. But we're not able to because we've been so influenced by our environment. And that seems to me to be the same sort of, like the Bible seems to talk that way about the way that when the Bible talks about the world, we're conformed to the world, or the world shapes us, friendship with the world, things like that, or people pleasing, what I've called the gaze, the progressive gaze, which I borrowed, which is a thing. So if we're doing the parallels, I'd be curious, Neil, like when I've used the term the progressive gaze as an explanation for why evangelicals in particular get steered because we live under the progressive gaze, I borrowed that from Toni Morrison, who talked about the white gaze as something that inhibited her ability to write as a Black author because she was always writing with the default white audience in mind, and therefore accommodating and sort of contorting herself to do it. And I was like, that's actually a really helpful psychological category. Who's your idealized audience and who's looking over your shoulder evaluating you? And I was like, I think Christians do this a lot. The Bible calls it people pleasing, but it's a real category that shapes our actions. But is that like if she's woke, or if that's like a woke concept, because that's where I learned it, was in the conversations about critical theory, does that make me woke right? Because I think, hey, I'm doing it, but instead of white gaze, it's progressive gaze.
Okay, there's a lot there. I want to cover all the things you hit. It's all right. So you mentioned immigration. That's a good one. And so I wrote, I'm writing a third book, and I have a whole section on ethnicity. So I agree there's this asymmetry. It's not stable. We can't denigrate white ethnicities and then valorize Black ethnicity. You can't do it. You can't do the same. You can't do that. It's not sustainable to always say it's awesome to be Black and proud. Black is beautiful. But then if you even mention anything about being white, you can't say I'm proud of being white. You can't say that. That's racist. You can't over the long term sustain that, because white guys are going to be like, there are people, critical race theorists will tell white males, you have no ethnicity. It's been stolen from you. You're not actually white. You're actually, Hungarian or Irish. And if you want to celebrate ethnicity, you got to go back and celebrate like your Dutch ancestry that's ridiculous. No one's Dutch. I'm not French Canadian or on my mom's. I have no connection. My lived ethnicity. I'm complicated because I'm American. And you want to say, by the way, my ethnicity is American. Amen. That's just it. No hyphenations. We're all American. We share this American ethos, American history. I'm fine with that. If you want them to, but my ethnicity, my sub-ethnicity is Black. Also, I have a unique heritage in the Deep South. Sure. But then we can't then say the only people who can't have a sub-ethnos are white people. That's going to be a disaster. So I go through this in my future book, hopefully, to talk about how do we thread the needle. But here's the thing. Why is it important to thread the needle? Well, I don't think it's merely like, oh, well, people are just frightened of white ethnos, and they shouldn't be. There's more to it than that. So let me quote from Engel's thread on Heritage America. He talks about how white people are kind of this Anglo-Protestant ethnic group that we should celebrate. But here's what he says, talking about immigration. There's a spectrum at play wherein some peoples are less threatening to its ethos, the ethos of Heritage America, than others. There's a high correlation between that spectrum and the broadening circles extending out from Western Europe. such that peoples like Indians or Southeast Asians or Ecuadorians or immigrated Africans are the least capable of fitting in and should be sent home immediately. Now, I talked to Engel about this because I said, wait a minute, what you're saying is that not just that we should shut down the borders, we should send home all illegal immigrants. You're not just saying that. You're saying we need to deport people that aren't Western Europeans. And I said, wait a minute, what about like third generation Asian immigrants? They're fought in wars for this country. They've been here for 60 years. And he's like, no, that doesn't count. Okay, what about an adopted African child? Well, we shouldn't break up families. We're not going to send that guy home. Well, what about first generation legal immigrants who came to this country, pledged allegiance to the U.S., they're in the army, they love America, they're U.S. citizens, they went through a whole process, but they're from Africa or Ecuador. Should they be deported as U.S. citizens? And he said basically yes. Why? Because they're not white, because they're not Western European. I mean, you can maybe squeak by if you're, Polish or something, but if you're from Ecuador, even if you're a naturalized U.S. citizen who's been here for 20 years, I'm sorry, you got to go. Yeah, and so if you're not thinking carefully, that leads to that. And what do you call that? I call that evil. I mean, this is their country now.
Sure.
So do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So and I think on the policy prescription, I think that would be if they were admitted legally. You deal with the cards you're dealt, not the ones that you weren't dealt. And so so just like with the Ellis Island thing, it's like it happened. You may regard it as a mistake historically. Oh, the president shouldn't have done that, or Congress shouldn't have done that. But it happened, and now you live with the consequences. I think I would say there's a similar thing going on here. But the larger point at play though is actually, so it seems to me in that quote though, the key issue is, are some peoples less threatening to the ethos than others? In other words, and this has to do with, I think there's two poles to this. I think one, it has to do with the self-confidence of sort of the receiving ethnicity. Okay, if there is such thing as an American ethnos, does it know what it is? And does it know what it's asking people to assimilate to? Right? And it seems to me that this is actually like a major difference between sort of that Ellis Island immigration wave and the more recent one in the last 30, 40 years, is that at that time, America knew sort of what it was. And this is the sort of thing that lots of people look back on now and say America was bad because of how, how proud it was and how self-consciously, proud to be an American it was. But there was an expectation. You come here, you're going to learn English, you're going to assimilate into American society. You can still, you've got your like you said, your sub-ethnicities where your foods are a little different than the foods of that group or something like that, and the customs that you practice. And you're bringing that in, melting pot, and so forth. But that there was sort of a central dominant, this again, Anglo-Protestant, I think is a really good rough and ready definition of what it was. So there was a religious dimension and sort of a historical roots. It's like the Blackstone, English Blackstone legal tradition, the King James Bible, Shakespeare, and then all of the subsequent American history in its American form, settler, westward expansion, George Washington, all of those things, including some of the gnarly bits like the Civil War and so forth. So that's what America was, and therefore it assimilated groups that were sort of adjacent to it. So the Western Europeans are easy examples, the Polish who are didn't speak English, or Irish Catholics and things like that. The difference now is that America does not have that same self-confidence, or if it does, it's a demented self-confidence. It's kind of what are we exporting? And it's like gay rainbow stuff, like
porn.
That, yeah. Yeah, you were. So that's who we are, and so when people come, it's like now it's all accommodate the newcomers, and so we're going to have 5 different languages spoken on all of our stuff. We're not. The expectation is not learn English. The expectation is no. We'll just have forms for every different ethnic group. And I think part of what, and then obviously on the religious side of things, like there is no confident Christian Protestant identity that says, hey, you don't have to be Protestant to be here. This is what Mohler said the other day. You don't have to be a Christian to be here, but you do need to recognize that the roots of this civilization and its fundamental commitments are Christian. That's important. And it's like, we don't have that confidence as a people. And so part of what these guys are saying is, hey, that does still exist in places. Like there are people, what CJ is calling Heritage America does still see itself sort of in that train, in that legacy downstream from all of that history, and says, hey, this is worth preserving. And so we need to do it. And insofar as we're going to have folks come in, it does matter where they come from. So when I think about this, even just independent, I think this is true, like not just of America, but of other nations. It does seem that the expectation that like religions could assimilate more easily. So Christians from another country could maybe assimilate to a Christian country more readily, even if they didn't if they were different ethnicities, right? So a Nigerian Christian assimilating would be different. But Islam is not an assimilationist religion. It doesn't come and assimilate to the people that it becomes. Instead, it comes and carves out enclaves and then seeks to take over. And it's like, that's different even than I would say Jewish groups, which tend not to which have there's Jewish enclaves. Like my father-in-law grew up in Queens in like a heavily Jewish neighborhood. But historically, Jews have sort of been honorary Protestants in America. Like they weren't Christians, but they were tolerated, welcomed, and so forth in the American context. And so there's these different groups that have been able to carve out space, but other ethnic groups don't do that. And so does that factor into how you think about immigration? And it seems to me that it should, in order to avoid the kind of balkanization that I think everybody recognizes will be disastrous down the road, right? Like at some point, like the center won't hold because there isn't a center, and it just becomes a power play based on, this 30% and that 30% and that 10%. And it's a dogfight because there will be a center. Like at some point, there will be a central dominant culture. The idea of a sort of universal multicultural society isn't workable unless you've got a strong something at the top that says, I set the rules and everybody has to play nice. That's like the Roman Empire. It's like, hey, we can have multiple things, but like the Roman army runs everything. Like we can put down rebellions. The Roman Empire is the central thing. And we have these sub-ethnicities within it. That could work, but is that what we want? Like, is that the kind of polity that we're aiming for? And it's like, I don't think so, but that's on the table if we don't deal with like, what do we mean by ethnicity? And what does it mean to act in your own interests as a people?
So again, two things in response. At the beginning, you wanted to separate out, the crazy online anonymous groypers who are anti-Semitic and racist from this Christian nationalist group, the dissident right group. They're different. What I'm pointing out here, but it seems like we have some, and all they're really talking about is what is the American ethnos? All they're doing. But now I'm seeing, but wait a minute, then you're also saying things like send home the brown people.
But he's not
right?
saying send home the brown people. Right?
Well, no, he's saying, let me quote again, peoples like Indians or Southeast Asians or Ecuadorians or immigrated Africans are the least capable of fitting in, should be sent home immediately. And he connects it to being close to Western Europe. That sent home. I clarified this with him. He does mean U.S. citizens. I actually took a poll on Twitter. Is it okay? Is it just to deport U.S. citizens who are foreign born but have committed no crime, including illegal immigration? They're legal. And 70% of people on my poll, non-scientific, but 70% said yes, that would be just. And I'm saying no, it would be unjust. That comes out of this wrong thinking about ethnicity. The other thing I'd say is you mentioned that, well, Christians in Nigeria can assimilate more easily to the Anglo-Protestant culture, whatever remains of it, than Muslims. And I agree with that. Now, Engel insists he's not, and Wolf also, he's not interested in these racialist principles, okay? But then when he talks about, well, who can't assimilate, he says it's a racialist principle. It's Western Europe versus the rest of the world. And again, he insists it's not about race or skin color, but he doesn't say things like, well, Nigerian evangelical, some country is like 80% evangelical, but they happen, I don't know the demographics, but there are countries out there. Like I think in the islands in the Pacific, there's some islands that are like 80% evangelical Christian. But they're brown. But if they want to come here, would Engel say, well, that's different than because they're Christians and they're evangelical Christians, they would fit right in? I don't think he'd say that because it is about these concentric circles emanating from, in his quote, extending out from Western Europe. If you're living in the Pacific, then you're not near Western Europe.
And that's interesting, Joe, because again, we're talking about an effort here where you guys both agree on the ethics, the morality. You even agree on certain things that make America America. And it used to be where we kind of all were. And I think what Neil's possibly looking for some clarity here is when it comes to ethnic identitarianism and why that is becoming the remedy in some of these writings, in terms of we hated it when other people would apply it with CRT. Why is this even part of the conversation? Because I've agreed with everything you've said, Joe, about where we are in the country, the generalizations, the issues with immigration, certain loss of our identity. Every time we think about our heritage, we are forced to think of it only in terms of slavery before abolition, because we don't think about the industrial age. We don't think about our economy. We don't think about all these nuclear families completely under attack at all times. I'm always in agreement with that. I think where it comes down to is what half this has justly been about: the ethnocentrism focus on, well, we just need to get rid of. In other words, and I don't expect you to answer all of this right away, and I want to end on these two groups' responses to how this oppression occurs, because I think they're different in responses, and I think both of you would agree with that. But how do we mobilize heritage Americans to act in their own group interest as well as be the church? I think that has to kind of play a part in the conversation.
Yeah. So I do think that the debate, so I don't agree with Engel's notion that you could deport U.S. citizens. Like, I just think that, but I think the unjustness of that has to do with, like, hey, you said they could come in on these terms. It would be different if someone's like, I guess, on a visa or something.
Playing the cards you're dealt is what you said.
If it's a temporary thing for a visa, and then it's like, hey, we're not going to renew that. I think that's permissible. Like, but just the idea we're going to just round up people and deport them, even though we admitted them legally, it's like, no, you play the cards you're dealt. So,
well, one more thing too. Would you also agree that it can't be this collective, well, you're from X country, therefore you can't assimilate? So obviously, don't you agree that there are people say, and he keeps saying, I'm not thinking in individualistic terms, which is another similarity with the critical theorist, but he's talking about collectives. But wouldn't you agree that there are people, like, let's say there's some enclave, there actually exist in India, there are enclaves of like evangelical Christians in India who've been there for generations even.
Right.
And if they want to immigrate here, they can assimilate much more easily. They're already believers. They maybe even have English culture is huge in places in India. So you wouldn't just say you can't come because you are too far away from Western Europe. Would you also say that's not a really good
right? Yeah, I would say it's going to get more particular and granular as you kind of get to the but I do think, and I think this is the issue, is I think that sort of debate about, like, okay, what are these concentric circles? What does adjacency mean here? Like here, okay, so but the first step is, so this is, I think, what's going on is, first it needs to identify, like, okay, what is the American ethnos? Like, what is the American people? Like, and does it exist? And does it have a continuity with the first 200 years of our existence? What is it? Okay, so now if you can answer that question, now given that, and given the last 40 years where it was contested and is still being contested, now what does it mean for you to act for the good of your people? And in such a way, and acting for the good of your people is not a zero-sum game, which means we now need to crush all the others and we're better than them. It's like, no, just in the same way that other peoples act in their own for the good of their own people at a political and social level. What does that look like? And then the debates are going to be, I think, precisely there. It's like, okay, what does adjacency mean? What does assimilation look like? And I don't think that someone like Engel, I don't know him well. I think I've literally met him once. But I think that would be a reasonable discussion. What wouldn't be is that if the attempt to have the discussion, when this is what actually happens, is, well, you're clearly a racist and a kinist, because you're trying to describe how would you navigate this Heritage America Anglo-Protestant thing, and therefore you're just a bad person, and therefore we can't even have that discussion. I think that's what these guys frequently will go, yeah, that's why we're not gonna, that's why you get blocked or whatever, is because it's, you sound like this, and therefore and whatever this is, the kinism thing, is typically used as a way to shut down or to, like, quarantine bad ideas. And I think that part of it is okay, we got to get over that and be able to go, what is actually good? What is true? What is ethnicity? Those are important questions. And they have been distorted in many ways by the rise of wokeness, and just like the weird ways that America thinks of itself as unique. This is part of, like, I was there when Stephen gave his recent talk in Ogden and found it really helpful at, sort of, his description of, like, American race relations are really weird historically compared to other groups. And because of that, we're always trying to shoehorn in funny ways, because everything gets conflated between race and ethnicity and whiteness and American, and all these sort of things get really confused. And his attempt was to try to bring some clarity to that by having clear definitions of what an ethnos is. And I think all of that's to the good, but it won't go anywhere, and it can't be fruitful insofar as even the attempt, even the language of like ethnocentrism, which I think is a word that everybody goes, oh, if what you mean is, but there's an ambiguity in it. It's like, well, if I'm seeking the good of my own family, is that a family centrism, a Rigney centrism? And it's like, well, there's a way that that's actually what God expects of me. I need to look well to the ways of my own household first. And so does that scale at sort of the peoplehood level? That's different than saying if Rigneys were like, Rigneys are better than other people, and we therefore have the right to put other people's under our thumb. It's like, well, that's superiority, vanity, vainglory. That's sin. But simply acting for the interests of my family isn't.
That's a good
And
point.
in a similar way, if Heritage America or Anglo-Protestants were to act in their own interest, this is part of, and Neil granted this, I think, in his thing about that positives. Asymmetry, where to have a black student union at a college or something like that, or a black fraternity would be acceptable, or for other ethnicities, right? South Indian groups that were to act in their own interest and to have political representation on behalf of their sub-ethnicity would be acceptable in the American context, but an Anglo-Protestant one would immediately get you tagged as evil and racist.
Right.
And insofar as that, and so that asymmetry is just where we're at. And so trying to dismantle to kind of go, okay, well, what would be good and right? How would we have these conversations? And to do so, I think as Christians, where our highest allegiance is to Christ, and that we have an allegiance to his people everywhere at some level, but then what does that look like on the ground in terms of forming of churches, forming of nations, forming of people?
I like that order of things that define the ethnos there of what America means. And then what you did, Joe, was create a difference between acting in one's interest and one's dominance. But this is the point that I wanted to end on. And Neil, does that clarify kind of what you were asking, Joe? Do you have any rebuttals?
Yeah, no, I think.
Before I move on, I want to let you.
But I think what Joe's doing is helpful, because I think that's what needs to happen, is that we need to draw boundaries. Like, okay, we're trying to talk about what is an ethnos. We should be able to have that conversation. You shouldn't be able to shut people down and say that's racist. You can't even talk about that. No, let's talk about it. So I think biblically. But then we don't want to say, because we're allowing this conversation, it's okay also to talk about things like, well, why can't whites be supreme over the world? We have to say, well, no, that's actually not okay. But not because it's just racist, because the Bible is actually against that.
Right. It's
not we're just labeling you. We're saying, no, there's actually, I think the problem is because we're silencing people that are trying to think carefully, we're like, well, then everything goes then. But we want to say, no, actually not everything does go. Some things are actually still evil and wrong.
Well, and this is where the confusion really does come, is to have some kind of racial pride, or to believe that simply because of your skin color or something that you're superior to others is ridiculous. It's just dumb. Like it's a stupid thing. It was stupid when it was like the dominant paradigm for a while. It was stupid then, it was evil then. But to talk about cultural superiority, that certain cultures more closely conform to God's law than others ought to be inbound. Okay. But because let
me give you a good argument for that, Joe. American culture in the 1800s under slavery was worse than it is after slavery.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's cultural. So there you go. People who say you can't say that. Yes, you can, because our culture used to be worse, and now in that way, at least it's better.
Yeah, in that way, and I think it is particular, right? So it's like, well, in some way, so it's like on the one hand, you might say, we're more righteous in that we don't oppress one particular class of people, but we do oppress the unborn, and we have destroyed the family. And so, family, the integrity of the family in the 1800s versus the integrity of the family in the 2000s. We're not better. We've actually regressed. We've gone backwards, and it's uglier. Or it's like, our American society's better in some ways than Aztec society. Although we're approaching, again, our abortion holocaust means that we're approaching Aztec levels of evil when it comes to that. But the point is that that's in bounds. Like evaluating cultures by the scriptures and then comparing them in certain respects to each other and saying this culture more fully is inbound. But if as soon as you do that and say this is better than that, you're going to get accused of being a racist, because they're going to say, well, you mean simply by virtue of phenotype and skin color. It's like, no, I'm talking about history, language, customs, laws, narratives. That's what we're talking about with ethnicity and culture. So I do think it's important just to say, like, on the one hand, we don't want racial pride and superiority. That's all out. But this is the weird thing. Like, ethnicity, as we're defining it, does admit of closer conformity to God or not, and therefore some form of, we call it superiority. And so that if that's on inbounds, it's going to get very fraught in a hurry. And there's a lot of people out there who are going to try to leverage that to steer people, right? Like that's a major steering wheel. And evangelicals in particular are susceptible because we don't want to be associated with all of those terrible things from history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That leads me to something that I'm going to mention and maybe have you guys back on sometime in the future to thoroughly discuss, because I think it would take a lot more time. But it's the response to what we've defined. The understanding that while we might call the woke right, we definitely can agree that these ideals are out there. I think Neil's been justified in knowing that there are some people that believe this, whether it's a dominant force with several of our friends, Joe. I think that has been properly up for grabs to discuss and say, no, I don't think this is what they were saying when this is being categorized as ethnocentrism. I thought that was incredible, the difference between the group's interest and a dominant force. But I will end it on this. The Retake America reaction that you clarified, Neil, when it comes to when this is happening. And I think we all agreed that these words of oppression, abuse, none of us are for that kind of drama. We need stats, like we need facts. We need to not repeat this over and over again in our own circles or in our own circles. But then the response for this oppression has been a difference in demanding through victimhood, unfair treatment and reparations versus post-millennial move out west, retake America. That's kind of that I have to throw post-millennial in there, Joe. That's kind of my thing. But that's what I'm seeing as the differences, major differences, like not at all the same, is in terms of their reaction, right? Or would you say that under CRT and those who have been proponents of CRT, that they are also trying to retake America? I guess that was the one thing out of your article where I didn't grasp the parallelisms proposed between, because I'm seeing this Ogden group, this Moscow group. Several of my friends are over there. Eric Kahn and I have known each other for 18 years. And so these are people that I've known forever who I know good and well aren't racist people. They're not racist, but they're definitely about believing in what makes them different, their group's interest in wanting to make sure America looks like it used to in several of the aspects Joe has mentioned when it comes to the family, when it comes to how things are treated, men working, those kind of things, concepts. Do you see any difference in that? Because I didn't think that parallelism was on.
Yeah, I mean, there are differences, obviously. We didn't get into the whole critical consciousness thing. I'd actually say that, there is an element of critical consciousness that is shared by the woke and left and the right, and deconstruction, like saying that actually you only believe that because you're blinded by whiteness, the patriarchy, versus being blinded by the post-war consensus, Judeo-Christianity. There is a parallel there. The last one, though, I would say that, they're not identical, but if the literature, CRT literature talks about the goal, the end goal being, quote, fundamental social transformation. It's not like superficial, it's not incremental, it's fundamental. That's their language for critical race theories. I would argue that, again, the woke right, whatever you want to call this group, they are arguing for the same thing. Now, in a totally different way. They don't want to have this intersectional transformation. They want to have essentially the opposite. But they do think it's not a matter of just tweaking the post-war consensus. They want to dismantle it. They're not just saying, we need to adapt our current systems. They're saying literally things like we need to get rid of the Civil Rights Act. We need to get rid of the 19th Amendment. We need to get rid of those major, and you're like, wait a minute, what? But my point is not they're identical, but that there is an element of quote unquote radical, not in the pejorative sense, but at the root, transforming America. So that's a similarity I see. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, well, and I do think that relative to the current consensus, I think all of us on this call, at least, I think would say, America's in need of some sort of like radical transformation, right? Like however defined, like the state of the country in terms of conformity to what God wants is bad. And so like if revival, renewal, reformation, whatever word you want to use for that kind of thing, I think all three of us would be like, yeah, we need that. And so then the question would be, well, what would that look like if it happened? And then now you're into, well, is it a recovery at some level of historic Christian political order? Like, are we trying to recover and apply that in new contexts with new technologies and some new challenges? But is it, man, our Christian forebears, our Protestant forebears had some really biblical, faithful frameworks for thinking about political order. And we ought to try to bring those to bear on our modern issues, which would require perhaps some reworking where we've gotten majorly out of whack. And it seems to me that like all of us would agree on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but like the critical race theorists, what they would want is revolution. So, and explicitly, some of these guys are not calling for, but are predicting an actual civil war. And they're accelerationists who actually want to foment that. So again, there is a parallel there.
I don't know that it's foment. I think it's budget for. So like I think anybody who's not budgeting for, like when you look at the state of things and you go,
yeah.
And so if you know history at all and you see what happens when you have this the level of ideological, religious, political difference that you have, say, today between, I mean, just take even like sort of blue state, red state America as a rough and ready. And you go like, is that sustainable? Is there like, what's the thing? Like when we say we want to unite America around what exactly? Like, it's really hard to kind of identify because at every level, whether it's sort of like the policy level, but if you go down to the sort of the transcendent moral order level, it's like it would be, you read That Hideous Strength and you're like, let's unite St. Anne's and the NICE. And it's like, it's not going to happen. You can't unite Bellbury and St. Anne's. Those are not going to mix. And it's like, well, we live in a society that contains both in substantial numbers.
The great divorce. There's no marriage between heaven and hell.
Exactly. And so at some level, you and then you go, okay, so we're kind of in the, people talk about the cold Civil War, right? Mm-hmm. So it's we're fighting through elections and things like that. Do you begin to budget for what happens if it cracks up? What happens if it fragments? And it seems to me that some of those guys, and I think this is wise to say, okay, in that event, how should you be thinking? What should you be doing? How should you be preparing for that contingency? Which isn't the same as saying, I really am rooting for a new civil war. It's like, I'd rather have the revival. I'd rather have, I'd even settle for like a, radically decentralized federalist solution where certain states are able to kind of do their own thing. And, kind of the way that the Roman Empire cracked up eventually, and you had different parts of it. All of that seems like there's a number of different ways it could go, but budgeting for balkanization is different than rooting for balkanization. And
there's some of both, I think. But some of both.
But some of the rooting is right now. You've got the hegemony. You've got a woke tyranny, right, that's seeking to impose itself through the administrative state. I think this is where Aaron McIntyre's book was really helpful at drawing attention to the sort of public-private partnership that tries to the managerial attempt to bring order to all areas of human society and to squash any resistance. And it's like, okay, if my choices are living under the woke administrative state or increasing balkanization, it's like, yeah, you better believe I want increasing balkanization. I want to be able to carve out a place where I can raise my family and I can be a faithful Christian and not have to lie, not have to live by the lies that woke administrative state is proposing. And so that's not like, I don't love it, but it's like, yeah, I'd rather have the balkanization. I think that's a reasonable thing. The other thing, this is an important point that I wanted to get to, and I know we've gone really long, but it's fine. Everybody's going to love it. It's going to be great. Because I think Neil and I both share a hostility to Bulverism, where rather than refuting an argument, you show its psychological roots and then therefore treat it as though it's been refuted. And it's fair to say, right, that part of your criticism, Neil, in your article, you didn't use the term Bulverism, but I was like writing in my margin. Yeah,
Bulverism. Yeah.
This is Bulverism. He thinks that the woke right guys are doing Bulverism. I think it's important to distinguish two ways that psychological motivations are brought into the discussion. One is Bulverism, where explaining the psychological motivation substitutes for argumentation. That's what Lewis was critiquing when he invented the term Bulverism and blasted it. I think that's different than saying, hey, here's my arguments, right? So I think, for example, Stephen, I would make arguments for a lot of these things from Protestant political principles, biblical principles. And then when people resist them, trying to say what accounts for the inability to even have a rational argument about this, and then to appeal at that point to speculate about psychological motives. I think the Bible actually does that form, where it does things like when the Bible talks about the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their heart. So there it's, hey, there's an ignorance, or Romans 1, there's a truth suppression. Why don't they believe in the living God? Because they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. That's not an argument for God's existence, simply saying someone's suppressing the truth. That's not an argument for his existence, but it's an explanation for why, given the evidence, they refuse to entertain it. And I think that's more what's going on with the dissident right guys. It's not a substitute for argument. It's an addition to. And so in the places where Stephen does the post-war consensus and says, oh, it's convenient that your views just happen to align, that biblical Christianity just happens to be post-war consensus. I don't think that's Bulverism, because he's made the arguments elsewhere, right? So you've got both arguments and explanation of psychological motives, not substitute one for the other. So I just wanted to make that distinction that I think is different even than what was going on with the woke left, where there was actual Bulverism. I don't need to refute this. I just need to deconstruct the power play and consider it refuted, consider it done.
Neil, final thoughts on it?
Yeah, I do think that there is Bulverism on both sides. You're like, oh, you just say that because you're racist. Well, that's not an argument. It's just, okay, right. I say, okay, fine, I'm racist, but what's wrong with my argument? What I would say, and Twitter's a tough medium because it's such confined space, but you can say, well, Stephen wasn't just doing Bulverism, but there's a whole genre of tweets he has, like, how convenient that, where there's no argument there. And again, it's a tweet. I get it. You can't have an argument into the tweet. But one thing I thought was interesting is that a guy named Benjamin Mowbray, who was a student with Stephen at LSU, I guess, but he made him claim on Aaron's Wren's blog that, no one engages with Wolf's arguments. They just call him racist. And I said, that's not true. Like, every review of Stephen's book that I've seen, I've read like 10 reviews of his book, they all went for his arguments and said these arguments are false over and over and over again. Kevin DeYoung's review, my review, Brian Madison's review, but there's so many out there. So now, but I'm just saying, given our propensity, again, both sides, to engage in Bulverism, dismissing arguments because, oh, you're racist, oh, you're a post-war consensus guy, you're a liberal, I think we need to be very hesitant to employ that language. And again, so I have seen that much more explicitly with other hangers-on the dissident right, where I have a whole list of tweets from people saying, he's Indian, you sound like a female genitals, I called a pseudo-Christian demon, I deserve to be catapulted out of the country. That's actually from a guy using the CREC, the CREC member anyway, but that's just from yesterday, by the way. Those are from the last 3 days, July 8th through July 9th. All these arguments like that, where there's no one saying, well, this statement is false. Right. Just that somehow I'm Indian and whatever I am, I'm half Indian. But that tendency has to be resisted. And it is the analogy of the Bulverism we see on the woke world.
Right.
Word point for point. So I just want to say, hey, that is a thing also that we should avoid.
Yep. I agree with Bulverism's bad if it's a substitute for argument.
Yeah.
That's a great place to put it, guys. Thank you so much for that. I just sat back and listened to a lot of that and felt like I just got a class for free. So I really appreciate your wisdom and your kindness towards each other. The consistency of just wanting to see the Bible continue to be the authority of our lives in this conversation was dominant. If you couldn't tell, it really was. And so I thought that we're just very thankful for the Lord and his sovereignty over this discussion. So awesome, guys. Thank you so much for being on. Hope to have you on maybe sometime in the future. This could go for another 3 hours, I have no doubt. But I appreciate you both. Thank you for coming on, and hopefully we get to talk again soon. Thank you guys so much for listening. You can listen to We Bear Witness podcasts wherever podcasts are platformed or streaming. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Get these guys' books. Go listen to their stuff. They know what they're talking about. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. If you like what you heard today and you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe wherever you're hearing the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, leave a comment, or you can email us at wbearwpodcast@gmail.com. We'd be happy to hear your thoughts on the episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.